The opioid epidemic gained a lot of momentum and attention in 2019, but it started back in 1996 with the introduction of Oxycontin. Today we're going to talk about how this epidemic started, its foundation, and some of the long-term causes and problems that it's going to create for our citizens. Welcome back to Hashtag Loaded, everybody. Got Andrea and I here in our new studio.
Yeah.
More of a radio broadcast kind of a situation.
I know.
So
We've got
some
these.
things out.
I don't know if this is a boom mic. It's like right up in my face, and so I guess now hopefully y'all will be able to hear me because I've noticed on several episodes, you come through loud and clear, and I'm a little quiet.
Yeah, I think sometimes I yell into the microphone, so that might be part of it.
I mean, is it wrong to say you're just a loud person?
It's fine.
My laughs are loud, let's put it that way.
Well, today we're going to talk about opioids and the epidemic that started with opioids. I mean, it really got a lot of attention in 2019. Mm-hmm. We're going to go through some of the lawsuits that were filed. Mm-hmm. And the reason this is here recently gained some more attention is with the death of Colt Brennan, who's a former NFL quarterback, known more for his time at the University of Hawaii. He was a football star there. He actually finished third in the Heisman voting. Well, while he was there.
I know what that trophy looks like.
That's good. That's good.
And you should be proud of me.
I am proud.
Thank you.
He also led the Rainbow Warriors, that's their mascot, to a BCS bowl game, which was something that really none of these smaller schools like Hawaii had done before. Mm-hmm. He had some issues in his past after he left Hawaii, while he was still at Hawaii, and after he left. A couple of arrests, had some unfortunate injuries, had a car wreck that derailed his pro and semi-pro football career. But what happened a couple weeks into May, he died of a fentanyl overdose while completing his 5th month in rehab. And he was there for it wasn't just opioid drugs, but it was a bunch of other stuff. But the reason this is so salient is that a lot of the opioid problem, which we're going to dissect here in a second, a lot of former athletes are ones that end up in these situations where they become addicted to opioids because of the rampant use of painkillers for sports injuries, surgeries, things that they undergo. And then a lot of those problems, or the sequence of how those problems arose, they also get translated or at least applied to a lot of the other problems that a lot of non-athletes have dealt with that have led to this kind of snowball.
Well, also, too, I think veterans are another population, right, that have a huge opioid crisis. So, they are in these, war-torn areas, right? They come back and they've had horrific injuries, some of them. And so, you come back to the States, you're in the VA, you've been hepped up on painkillers to survive the trip back from, Afghanistan or Iraq to come back to the U.S. And then you come here, you go through rehab, and they cut off your painkiller supply. And not rehab like rehab for celebrities, but like a rehabilitation process, like learning to walk again with like a half amputated leg or something. Right. And so, I mean, I can only imagine how difficult that must be when they've been through so much and now all of a sudden they're just denied medication to prevent them from being in pain all day, every day. Yeah. No wonder these, veterans are desperate to seek out something to mitigate the pain. For sure.
And when we get to talking about to and bigger picture planning, I want to come back to that analogy because I think that's part of the problem is that you're setting these patients up to need these drugs, need something to relieve the pain that they're going through.
And it's hard too, right, to even get them. I wonder, I'm no medical doctor, but I almost wonder if there's something in the middle. Because I remember when I was hospitalized in Russia because it was a severe stomach problem, and don't eat bad seafood in Russia. It was not good. My best friend's dad is a doctor, and I was in so much pain, and he felt really bad. But at the same time, he's like, I can't prescribe pain medication for you because of how strict the rules are on painkillers. He's like, I can give you antibiotics. I can try to help you get rid of the bacteria. I can't give you anything for pain.
And some of the stuff we're going to talk about, it's going to show why there's some of these restrictions are there, but I think there's a better solution, which I'll share towards the end of the episode. So let's dive in. What is an opioid? We throw this term around, and from the CDC, don't at me. There's a lot of people that hate the CDC right now. An opioid is defined as a natural synthetic or semi-synthetic chemical that interacts with the opioid receptors on the nerve cells in your body and in your brain, and it reduces the intensity of pain and pain signals and feelings of pain. And so it actually attaches to the nerve cells and blocks those pain sensors. It includes the illegal drug heroin, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, and pain medications that are available legally by prescription, such as Oxycontin, hydrocodone, codeine, morphine, and many others. Now, part of the problem is, and this is something I learned here recently, these prescription opioids, they produce this euphoria in addition to the pain relief. And so, that's if you've ever read an account of someone who's used heroin or read anything about heroin, that's part of the deal with heroin, is it provides this huge jolt of euphoria in your brain.
So the whole upper situation.
And the stimulant to your nerves is just something that's the reason like people are chasing that heroin high so much.
Yeah.
And so these prescription pain pills, they're not doing it on the same level as heroin, at least not that I'm aware of, but that's still happening in there, and that's an addictive
degree.
Right, and that's an addictive.
Yeah, it's an extremely addictive thing, right? Because that's why people die of overdoses, is because, at least from reading, who is the Rolling Stones drummer, Keith Richards?
Yes.
Yeah, so I read his biography, and it was really wild. He had this rule about taking heroin and cocaine. He's like, I tried to not take more than I did last time. He's like, because if you take more than you did last time, or especially if you take substantially more, he's like, you're trying to get that high, but it's so easy to overdo it, take too much, and then lights out. Yeah. And so I thought, I think he's still alive, isn't he?
I don't know. But responsible drug use, hey.
Maybe don't do heroin and cocaine.
So opioids they're a Schedule II drug in the Federal Controlled Substances Act. We talked a little bit about that in our federal sentencing guideline episode, where the schedules, they warrant how they're punished, how they're treated. And there are a significant amount, and I'm not going to go through all of them because it's just too many, but there's a significant amount, as you pointed out, federal regulations on how and why the drugs can be prescribed. Yes. And it's really aimed, this is kind of the mission behind it, they're aimed at balancing the control of the dangerous substances and all the problems like the addictions and the overdoses with access for legitimate uses of these drugs for pain relief purposes.
Yeah, like providing a moderate amount of pain relief to veterans who are learning to walk again with more injuries or something.
Right. And so I want to kind of now talk about what I'm calling the rise of the epidemic. So it really...
I feel like we need a chart for this or something.
Right. 1999 marked the beginning of the widespread prescription of these opioid drugs for pain. This came after Oxycontin, which is kind of the most notorious one, was invented or finally finalized in 1996.
Wasn't there like a Ben Affleck movie with Blake Lively in it where she was like addicted to Oxy? Her character was. Yeah. It was set in Boston. I feel like all his movies are.
Wait. Was that the town?
I think so.
Yeah, Blake Lively was in that.
Yeah.
And that was, the bigger one on that is the the robbing of the armored cars. But
I watched it for Blake Lively. Let's be real.
Sure.
Her hair is perfect every time.
Oh, geez. So in 2010, heroin deaths started spiking, which again, this is the natural progression of what tends to happen. Going off of like your veterans example earlier, someone is prescribed a prescription opioid drug for pain relief.
Oxy, Vicodin,
hydrocodone, those types of things. Then the prescription runs out. The doctor is restricted from prescribing more because of these addictive issues, or the doctor may prescribe more. May happen for a while, but at some point it stops, and the pain's still there.
Or what happens is that they keep taking the same amount of painkillers, but the effect is lessening and lessening.
Yeah. So they take more.
They take more, and the doctor doesn't up the prescription because they're like, this is dangerous. I'm not going to up the prescription. I'm giving you enough to manage.
Yeah. And so then you go to self-medication, and that's when you start turning to things like fentanyl and heroin. And fentanyl, really, that's 2013 is when we saw a spike in the use of fentanyl. This is a stat that was crazy to me, and this comes from the CDC, but 70% of all overdose deaths in 2019 were from an opioid-based drug.
I'm not surprised.
It makes sense because of again, how widespread the problem is, which we're seeing with all the litigation that's here. And a lot of the blame here is that these legally prescribed drugs, they're largely prescribed without full information about side effects, the long-term addictive problems associated with them. And, we talked about earlier, it's common in athletes to treat sports injuries and recoveries, and it, can lead to these self-medications. And so then in 2019, we start seeing a lot of lawsuits filed.
Yeah, I remember the one in Oklahoma.
Yeah, and that was the first one that came out where there was an actual judgment issue, which, as we know in the legal world, whenever you're dealing with a big issue like this, or even car wrecks, whatever, if there's a big seminal case that comes out that kind of it'll set the standard. If it actually goes to jury or it goes to the judge, and then from there, all settlements, they have to look back at this and think, okay, we can roll the dice and it can get worse, it can be less, but this is kind of our benchmark, and so it changes the game when it comes to settlement numbers.
I definitely look at those cases when I'm writing my initial case evaluations for all my clients. And I'm like, so here's your settlement range.
Right, exactly.
Do you want to gamble or not?
Exactly. And so let's talk about the lawsuits themselves, the players that are in them. We've got the physicians who are prescribing the drugs. We've got the distributors who are distributing and marketing the drugs. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, which they're the biggest players in the field. They're the ones that fell first. And a lot of those have been already resolved, and now they're going down to the distributors a little more. But the plaintiffs, the interesting thing about this is that the plaintiffs in these cases are largely counties and cities.
Which is wild, because you would think it's family members of people who died of an opioid overdose, but it's not.
And in 2019, I thought we would see more individual plaintiffs come out and start filing, but we really hadn't seen much of that. We've seen some of it. We hadn't seen much of it. And so these counties are typically filing under some form of a public nuisance.
Yeah, I was about to ask. So how are the counties even getting standing? And for those who don't remember what standing is basically the legal fiction, if you will, that says you meet these certain markers, right? You've been injured, you have the damage to show for it, so on and so forth. You actually now have standing to sue, right? You've been affected.
Right. And that's, the way that they wrapped this in was public nuisance, and I'm not going to give the elemental definition because it's different in every state. But
and its nuisance is very detailed.
Very strange,
Public, private, quasi, blah, blah, blah.
So basically what the paraphrase version of this is they're saying, you've created such a problem in this county by what you've done, manufacturing these drugs, and we'll get into the details of that it has created a widespread problem in the county for our citizens.
And nuisance, like we're saying earlier, it's a very specific legal term. I'm sure I don't want people to get triggered and be like, oh, you think that opioids are a nuisance? Because nuisance connotates like, oh, there's a fly buzzing near me. What a nuisance. No, like nuisance is a very specific legal term.
And it's a lot more intense in the legal world.
It's very intense. Yes.
So it makes sense that this was classified under that. And so these counties are suing, they're suing under that basis, and they're the main kind of catchphrase, and I'm going to read this because it was used in the Oklahoma case, which is the big one we're going to talk about in a second, and then that's just been proliferated in all these other cases, is that these reps are trained to promote these pills for commissions, and they're trained to do this to these doctors without warnings or studies to train or educate these physicians on the addictive dangers of these opioids. And they're getting commissions based on what they're selling to these doctors and how much they can get this doctor to push out this opioid pill. And the pharma companies have been accused of lining their pockets with little regard for the known problems with these opioid prescriptions. And so the biggest lawsuit, let's just jump into it, is Johnson & Johnson was the first major judgment in Oklahoma.
Oh, Johnson & Johnson. You're always in the news.
I was going to say this is kind of ill timing for them right now, but they got hit with a $572 million judgment in Oklahoma, nearly double what the other companies that were in that lawsuit settled for merely weeks before the judgment.
Wild. Wild.
And it was, when it was about to come down, I mean, I was watching it and I was thinking, okay, these guys settled for 28, 56 million. Johnson & Johnson's going to roll the dice, and they just got
slammed.
They got whacked with 572. And the judge came out and said that he ruled this way because of the aggressive and misleading marketing campaign that overstated how effective the drugs were for treating pain and understated the risk of addiction. And it created a roadmap for these other counties. And here's the problem is that you look at, and this is, back in 2019, there were a number of legal analysts that jumped on and looked at all these things. And in my opinion, and I agree with a lot of the opinions I heard, the problem is you look at logistically how this stuff goes down. These pharma reps, they come into a doctor's office. The doctor has 5 to 10 minutes to meet with them. They pitch these drugs. They talk about them real quick. And then the doctor's like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. I'll start prescribing this. he or she goes back to starting to treat their patients again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, look, at the end of the day, the doctor wants to make sure that their patients are taken care of. Right. And they're like, maybe the doctor is thinking, oh, I'll have time to like do the research into the science of these drugs later. I have people who need me, and doctors are notoriously pressed for time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to act like I know anything about what a doctor's daily life is or how he or she, conducts things like researching the drugs further. But they put their trust in some of these reps because they develop a personal relationship with them, just like you or I would with a trusted lawyer friend or some other, somebody that we talk to about
a CPA.
Yeah. And so they're depending on this rep to come in and give them good information. And so, and these reps are trained to sell these drugs.
Yeah, they're very persuasive.
Yeah. And so without giving them more information, education, training on how addictive these things were back when they were prescribing them. And maybe that's because the company didn't do enough research to figure it out.
Yeah, and maybe they didn't. Maybe Johnson & Johnson didn't do the appropriate research. Maybe they were giving incorrect information to these doctors. I don't know.
Yeah. And so then you're left with a doctor who's trying to help his or her patient out, doesn't understand how addictive these drugs can be, and so they don't know. I mean, we just talked about the doctors being pressed for time. They're not really going to have enough time to research this and vet this the way they need to.
Right. I mean, this is, chemistry, these drugs, right?
Yeah.
And chemistry is kind of abstract when you have someone who, can't lift their arm, past 12 degrees because they're in so much pain.
Right.
You want to help them.
Right. Absolutely. And so, that's what led to, that was kind of the culmination of how the Oklahoma case came down. After that, there were more than 2,000 lawsuits that were consolidated into the national prescription opioid litigation, which ended up being consolidated into Ohio federal court in October 2019. Settled there on the courthouse steps, right before litigation, right before the case started, for $260 million. And then Purdue Pharma has been the biggest story throughout all this because they were the OxyContin manufacturer. They were kind of seen as the head boss, if you will, that started
the head honcho, El Jefe.
Right, El Jefe.
Or Jefa. I don't know how to say that in Spanish. I need Spencer to tell me.
Well, and what's interesting like this is similar to kind of what the Boy Scouts did when they got sued with everything. It pushed Purdue into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is the restructuring.
Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Yeah, and so, and without going into great detail in bankruptcy, there's a difference between liquidating assets and just selling everything and then Chapter 11. So what does the reorganization chapter mean, really?
Oh gosh, I haven't done bankruptcy in so long. So basically, you're reorganizing things. You're trying to dissolve and transfer assets to a new company, and in this case, you had a board selected by, I think, wasn't it the plaintiffs?
Yeah.
In the lawsuit that selected who's going to be on the board of this new company. And then that's what that new company then obtained the reorganized bits of the old company. Right. So it's basically reincarnation, if you will,
for the purposes of trying to meet your obligations that you owe, your money, your liabilities, all that kind of stuff. Now, and then the family behind Purdue Pharma, they were actually forced to give over a certain amount of personal assets to help satisfy.
I do recall that.
Yeah, which is crazy. I mean, I say they were forced. In the settlement, they agreed to give over a certain amount of assets in the bankruptcy proceeding. The irony of this, to me, is that part of this reorganization is that the plaintiffs were going to receive percentages of OxyContin sales moving forward. Which
is so ironic because they're receiving sales of the drugs that they were complaining about.
Right.
So you're like, wait, this is blood money or something.
Right.
Move over blood diamonds. Now you've got blood oxy.
Yeah. No, I just thought, I find that it makes sense as a solution because it provides more money to go to these victims.
But at the same time, my gosh, just the concept of it, it's kind of atrocious.
137% agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Not 138%.
Rachel gives me a hard time. I say 137 for some reason. I don't know why.
That's so weird.
I don't know why. That's my all in, I agree with everything you're saying.
Okay, so if you ever tell me 136%, I'm going to be like,
I don't think I've ever said 136%.
Okay.
So I think we're good there.
Okay.
The kind of the summation of all this, part of the reason the counties are the right person to be suing for this is because... Person, entity, player.
Legally, they are considered people.
They are. We already talked about the nuisance. You're causing all these problems with the drugs. There's also a much deeper seated issue with that because when you get to the self-medication part where patients are now trying to self-medicate,
Like they're literally going on the streets and finding drug dealers to purchase fentanyl and heroin.
And so then you're just creating this whole snowball, circular effect of, okay, now we've got more crime in our city. Now we've got more, there's more drug trade, there's more drug manufacturing, there's more distribution, there's more of the
cartel violence is now, you've opened the door and you've ushered them in on a frickin' red carpet, because, when there is demand, supply will surely rise to meet it.
Right. And so that's the whole reason the counties jumped in on this and filed the lawsuit on the behalf of the county, because you're not just having problems that your citizens being harmed by the under appreciation of these drugs or the lack of information about these drugs. It's the crime that stems from it as well. And so my opinion on this is that we are going to see more regulations on how to prescribe these drugs and when and where and all that stuff. That's fine. I think that you're too late in the game at that point, because really what needs to happen is there needs to be on the front end more information given to the physicians. There needs to be better training and more regulation with how these drugs are sold and pitched to the physicians. And going full circle back to what you were talking about earlier, if we've got somebody that's got a pain problem that needs this kind of medication, we've got to try to figure out another solution on the front end of how to treat this problem, because once you start treating the problem with the pain medication, the tolerance builds up, the dependency builds up, and then we're just creating this snowball effect.
And at the end of the day, you're treating the symptom, not the root cause of the problem. And that was something that I'm very grateful. My best friend's dad, even though I was in horrific pain when I had my stomach issue in Russia, legally he couldn't give me pain medication because the restrictions were too great. But I don't think he would have given it to me anyway, besides maybe like Tylenol, or like extra strength Tylenol, because he wouldn't want to run any risk of me ever getting addicted to a painkiller. And I really appreciate that. And I wouldn't want to run that risk either. And so, he knew how addictive these things were. And he's like, I wouldn't do that to you. I would not run that risk. Yeah. I wouldn't do that to someone I love.
No, and that's foresight. That's the foresight that we need. And I think that one of the positives, I'm a serial optimist. One of the positives of all this stuff is that more awareness about the dangers of these drugs and more of an effort to try and figure out other solutions other than using these opioid addictive prescription medications.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think that in the case of veterans, especially, I think allowing VA doctors and the doctors who are there treating these veterans after they receive their initial wound that winds up causing them all this pain, more care, more physical therapy, more help to address the root cause instead of just, slapping a Band-Aid on it with a painkiller and addressing the symptom is needed.
Yeah.
And I mean, these people have already done so much for our country. The least we can do is try to help them with the root cause of their pain.
Yeah. Well, and it'll be interesting to see how these lawsuits play out, how long they stretch out, because they're still ongoing right now. We're 2 years into it. And a lot of people have talked about that these will be similar to like the big tobacco lawsuits back in the 80s.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
I don't know if they'll stretch out that long, but they are stretching out a lot longer than most people thought. So it'll be interesting to see how they turn out. And hopefully the counties that take these judgments can use it for rehabilitation, remediation, all the issues that have been caused by this widespread use of these drugs.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again next time.
Till next time. Hey y'all, don't go. We have closing arguments coming up for you in just a second. But before you listen, make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast if you got any value from today's episode. And please share the podcast with others. And if you want to interact with Austin or me, or tell us what you want to hear next, you can find me on Instagram at andrea.s.turner, Austin at the Dallas Lawyer spelled out, or the podcast #lawyered spelled out. Look forward to hearing from you.
Lubbock, Texas, the hometown of my alma mater, has declared itself a sanctuary city for the unborn, passing a local ban on pretty much all abortions. This is coming in the wake of the Texas state legislature considering a law that would bar abortions as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy. Lubbock is one of 25 cities, all but 2 which are located in Texas, that has laws banning abortions, but the rest of in towns of 100 or 1,000 people whereas Lubbock has 260,000 people and is a medical hub for about 1 million people in West Texas. The law bans all abortions except when a woman's life is in danger and permits any Texas citizen and a family member of any woman receiving an abortion to sue the provider who provided that actual abortion service. The ACLU and Planned Parenthood are weighing options for legal action, but this is absolutely a response to the 6-3 conservative majority swing on the U.S. Supreme Court in an attempt to try to chip away at Roe versus Wade. It'll be interesting to see what happens here because we can guarantee that some lawsuit will be filed, and this will end up before the Supreme Court for consideration.